In 2021, the voluntary carbon market reached its peak. Buyers spent over $2.1 billion on emission offsets, with the majority of that capital directed toward protecting forests and land. That peak was short-lived. Over the following 3 years, the market endured a severe contraction. By 2024, total transaction volumes had dropped by 25%. This graph tracks carbon prices across sectors. Notice the steep decline from 2022. By 2023, plummeting investor confidence spiked due diligence requirements. Market activity stalled entirely as journalists and grassroots organizations exposed severe operational flaws, directly challenging the underlying integrity of these credits. The multi-billion-dollar mechanism engineered to finance global forest protection is currently financially bleeding out. Corporate buyers are retreating because they no longer trust the reliability of the underlying product. The necessity of correcting this is absolute. Agriculture and land use change account for 18% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. Without nature-based solutions, international climate targets are mathematically impossible to reach. Yet the market is experiencing a massive pricing divergence. Investors aren't penalizing all carbon projects equally. Looking back at our chart, you can see this split clearly. Credits for carbon removal, like planting new trees, command a premium, climbing past $15.50 per ton. Meanwhile, REDD+ credits, paying to keep existing forests standing, are flatlining near $5.30. The variable driving this collapse is social integrity. While early criticisms focused on the technical math used to calculate baseline emissions, the scrutiny has shifted. The market is reacting to reports of land grabbing, forced evictions, and the violation of indigenous rights in project zones. Investors now discount the value of a credit based on the financial and reputational risk of ignoring the communities who live in and steward these forests. Environmental integrity determines what a carbon credit represents. The current failure is a crisis of how that credit is generated. The fatal flaw lies in the unresolved legal relationship between national governments and local customary stewards. To understand how this architecture fractures, we have to look at the Mekong region. Cambodia, Lao PDR, and Viet Nam serve as the live fire stress test for carbon markets, facing intense pressure from rapid, starkly cleared agricultural expansion. This region is a center of extraordinary biocultural diversity. It is home to 70 million indigenous peoples and local communities who rely directly on these natural ecosystems for their survival. They are facing a staggering environmental threat. Across the region, over 16 million hectares of tree cover have been wiped out since 2001, roughly the landmass of Cambodia. The primary driver is clear. Permanent and shifting agriculture are responsible for over 90% of all tree cover loss. The economic math is unforgiving. When a carbon credit trades at barely $5 a ton, that revenue cannot outcompete the immediate profitability of clearing land to plant rubber, cassava, or other export crops. Without an ironclad legal architecture protecting the forests and the people inside them, carbon markets and emerging economies will lose the price war against industrial agriculture. For a forest carbon market to function, it requires 4 structural pillars of social integrity. The first is explicit, codified carbon rights. In the Mekong, the state generally claims absolute ownership of all natural resources. By default, governments assume they own the physical carbon stored inside the trees. But that statutory claim directly conflicts with reality. Customary stewards have managed these specific forests for generations. Yet, because their traditional land tenure is rarely formalized in national law, they have no legal standing to sell or benefit from the carbon on their own land. This creates a massive financial shockwave. If the local stewards performing the actual labor of protecting the forest do not legally own the carbon, the asset itself is legally contested. Institutional investors are beginning to recognize the reality. Buying a REDD+ credit without codified local carbon rights is the equivalent of buying a house from someone who does not hold the deed. That legal void inevitably shatters the second and third pillars: free, prior, and informed consent, and equitable benefit sharing. Different countries attempt to navigate this in different ways. Cambodia has relied heavily on decentralized, NGO-managed projects for the voluntary market, while Lao PDR and Viet Nam focus on massive, state-led jurisdictional models, driven by institutions like the World Bank. Regardless of the model, generating a verified credit requires intensive coordination on the ground. project developers rely entirely on local communities to monitor borders, measure tree growth, and prevent illegal logging. But when developers fail to secure true consent, the system breaks. In Cambodia's Southern Cardamom Red Plus project, allegations of property destruction and forced evictions of Indigenous peoples prompted the main carbon registry to completely suspend the trade of their credits. Project developers frequently confuse legally weak consultation with actual consent. True consent means a community possesses the unilateral power to veto a project entirely. When consent is treated as a checkbox and revenue distribution is restricted only to those with formal state land titles, these projects turn the most essential stewards of the forest into operational adversaries. Which brings us to the fourth pillar, independent grievance redress mechanisms. Currently, when disputes arise over land boundaries or missing payments, the resolution process is almost entirely controlled by the project developers themselves. There is rarely an independent, neutral body for local communities to appeal to. This creates a dangerous operational feedback loop. When legitimate local grievances are ignored by the very entities profiting from the project, those disputes rapidly escalate into physical blockades, or communities revert to clearing the land to survive. That local friction triggers immediate deforestation reversals. The exact trees the buyer paid millions to protect are cut down or burned to ash, releasing the stored carbon straight back into the atmosphere. The defining metric of a carbon credit is its permanence, but permanence is a mathematical illusion if a project lacks an independent safety valve to resolve the inevitable local conflicts that threaten the forest. To prevent a total collapse of the voluntary market, buyers and regulators are pushing a transition toward a new iteration, often called VCM 2.0. The pressure to standardize these trades and restore trust has reached the highest levels of international climate negotiations, driving new multilateral agreements and strict supervisory mechanisms. We are now seeing the rise of an integrity premium. Major oversight bodies are establishing a new baseline rule. Rigorous social safeguards, including explicit benefit sharing and dispute resolution, must be hard-coded into the methodology before a single credit can be issued. Pledging to do no harm is no longer acceptable as a public relations talking point. Verifiable social integrity is now a strict financial prerequisite for market access. Carbon markets function as financial tools, but they cannot replace the role of sovereign state governance. The voluntary carbon market cannot manufacture local land tenure in regions where a host state refuses to legally recognize the customary rights of its own people. Securing nature-based finance requires non-market capital to be deployed first. Governments and donors must spend the money to formally map and codify local customary land rights before the trading can begin. The path to saving the Mekong's forests does not begin with pricing carbon. It begins with pricing the legal rights of the people who live there.